I'm actually not going to do a presentation on the technical stuff, but I'll be happy to answer any questions about that. But basically, this is the workflow of cinema. There's things that get shot, then there's technical stuff, and then there's things that we perceive. But it's not quite so simple, because different things happen in the brain and there are different interactions. We talk a lot about words that end in ness: brightness, loudness, sharpness. Words that end in ness are actually happening in your mind. So brightness is not the same as light level. Loudness is not the same as sound level. Sharpness is not the same as focus. To give you a little example of the complications, this is called a contrast sensitivity function. Does everybody see a sort of curve on the bottom going up higher on the right than on the left? Yes? Okay. It's not there. That's happening in your brain. And what do we get as a result of that? So this is the exercise portion of the presentation. Here are two composite pictures. They were made by Aude Oliva at MIT and Philippe Sheens at the University of Glasgow. I would imagine everyone in the front sees an angry man on the left and maybe a neutral woman on the right. Okay, now everybody get up and change places. Go to the back of the room, come to the front of the room. Okay, which is the angry person now in the back of the room? I'm holding my hands up so you can see I'm not doing anything. Yeah, come on forward while you're watching it. And at some point it's going to change. So what I've just shown you is that you can have different people in a movie theater watching the same movie and seeing completely different things. What's going on is in the composite images, the angry person on the left and the neutral person on the right are fairly high spatial frequency, or relative to the two of them, high spatial frequency, and the reverse is relative low spatial frequency. So as you go to the back of the room, the peak of your contrast sensitivity is shifting and you see the other image. So here are the earliest movies. On the left is by Edward Muybridge. It's photography based, so it's based on the pictures that he shot with multiple cameras, but actually an artist drew them onto a glass disc for projection. And on the right we have Louis Le Prince's pictures made in leads, which were the first on a continuous band, or what we today call film. Was that considered a perceptual improvement at the time? Now, here you can see that the drawn picture doesn't have any photographic detail, and the other pictures do have photographic detail, and so to us, there's an obvious perceptual improvement. But at the time, it's not quite so obvious. Perception is learned. So here's experiments that were done with kittens that were raised from birth not to see lines in a certain direction. And those black things with stripes are actually pieces of glass that had stripes painted on them, and they're over a gap. And if the kittens could perceive the stripes, then they knew there was a piece of glass there and they would step out on it. But if they couldn't perceive the stripes, they wouldn't step out on the glass. And the ones that were raised not to see, let's say, vertical lines, would not step on the vertical glass, but would step on the horizontal glass. So that's kittens. What about human beings? Here's something that Thomas Edison did starting in 1916. Edison, as many of you know, invented the phonograph in the late 1870s, but he was overtaken 13 years later by Victor, which came out with disc-based gramophones instead of cylinder-based phonographs. So Edison eventually decided he had to go with the discs as well, and he had to show people that his system was much better than the other people's system. So he came up with this idea of tone tests, either little ones, like you can see in the middle, where people were blindfolded, and an opera singer sang, and a phonograph played the opera singer, and people couldn't tell which was which, or big ones which were done in places like Carnegie Hall. So here's one from the Pittsburgh Post, where there was a presentation there, and the writer says, I thought it was going to be easy to tell, but then the lights went down, and when they came up, I couldn't tell the difference between the singer and the phonograph. Now, these are mechanical phonograph recordings. They're needles in a groove. There was nothing electrical about it whatsoever. They're wind-up devices, and yet people couldn't tell the difference between that and a live opera singer. Now, there was one mitigating factor. This is Anna Case, who was one of the opera singers, and she confessed in 1972 that when she did these tone tests, she made herself sound like a phonograph recording. But even aside from that, you still should be able to tell the difference between live and this mechanical recording, except at that time, it was just such a new thing to have any form of mechanical recording that we had not yet learned the difference between high fidelity and low fidelity. Similar kind of thing with the earliest movies. This is the first paying audience for movies, the Lumiere cinematograph. It's where we get the term cinema. And one of the movies they showed was a train coming into a station, which I'll show you in just a moment. And this is Henri de Parville, who was like the equivalent of a Scientific American editor. And he attended, and he said, one of my neighbors was so captivated, she sprang to her feet. From this is where the stories came that people fainted when they saw the locomotive. Well, let's see what she was watching. So this is approximately what they saw at the time. The camera is nowhere near the locomotive. It's on the platform. The train's coming in. There's people waiting there. It is black and white. It is silent. There was probably some noise. This is very, very similar to what the people were watching at the Lumiere cinematograph. And yet there was this tremendous excitement because, wow, moving pictures. We haven't seen anything like this before. Now, paying at the Lumiere cinematograph was actually an important thing because of a psychological function we have called cognitive dissonance. It's when we try to reconcile two different things in our minds. So the negatives of going to a movie theater are you pay the ticket price, you have to dedicate time to it, you have to travel to the theater, you have to put some effort into that, maybe you get a babysitter or something like that. The only positive is the quality of the movie. If the negatives outweigh the positives, then you were stupid. But you don't want to be stupid. So the top things can't change. The ticket price is what it was, the dedicated time is what it was, but the quality of the movie can change. So, hey, it must have been a better movie. And this is why cinema is considered an art and television is considered a craft. The Oscars are an important award, the Emmys are a less important award, because there's no effort involved in television, big effort involved in cinema. So here's an ad from the Pittsburgh Press in 1896, and I've blown up a section of it so you can see what movies were. The Baby Parade at Asbury Park, The Angry Waters of Dover Pier, Watermelon Eating Contest, a woman who does a wink, and so on and so forth. That's what people went to movie theaters to see, because that's all there was. And then we have this exciting thing that happened in 1895. The name of the movie is The Execution of Mary Stuart. Wow. Even today. Pretty amazing. He decapitated her. Well, it wasn't a her, it was a he, an actor in a dress, and there was a moment, if I were to show it again, where you would see very easily that they substituted a mannequin for the actor. But audiences didn't know about that. They didn't know about the craft, and so this was exciting. We just witnessed an execution, a beheading in the movie theater. So what just happened to that first workflow that I showed? We have added something non-technical. We've added a director. And the director has decided what to do. And one of the things he decided to do was substitute a mannequin for an actor. Well, that's kind of going backwards. That's going to a lesser thing, and yet it achieves the storytelling that the director wants. So less can often be more. In dream sequences, we make them hazy, low contrast, maybe wave things around. Binoculars, always we have the figure eight. Nobody looks through binoculars with a figure eight. Telephone call. Today, telephone calls sound just like being right there. But in a movie, a telephone call has to sound like this, because otherwise you don't know it's a telephone call. So here's a great Russian director, Sergei Eisenstein, director of Battleship Potemkin, and talking about aspect ratio, and I can tell you later why a widescreen is important. He says, no, it's my desire to intone the hymn of the male, the strong, the virile, active, vertical composition. Here are two great French directors, Jean Renoir, François Truffaut, and they both say color is a terrible thing to have happened to movies. Here's one maybe less famous, Michel Hazanavicius, and he says, sound, that's terrible. Why do we have sound? I know all these directors who would rather make silent movies. So who is Michel Hazanavicius? He won the Best Director of 2011 for the Best Picture of 2011, The Artist, which was effectively a silent black and white movie. And it grossed $133 million, more than $133 million worldwide, which is not bad. Here's more on directors' preferences, frame rate. There was a Technology and Engineering Emmy Award given in 2001 for the development of 24p, which is video at 24 frames per second when previously video had 60 images per second or 30 frames per second. But frame rate, there's also directors' preferences. Peter Jackson went to 48 in The Hobbit. If you attended the Ang Lee presentation last night, he talked about people complaining about that. But that movie that people complained about grossed more than $1 billion. Doug Trumbull in 1994 said, 60 frames per second is much too fast for a traditional fiction film. In 2014, he said, it's great because it makes you feel like you're right there. Now, there's also different viewing environments for cinema. This is another thing that Ang Lee mentioned yesterday. When you go to a movie theater, you're in a room that's dark, you're in a group of people. There's only one thing you can do, which is watch the screen, and there's only one reason you're there, which is to watch the screen. And it's a large, distant screen, and there have been tests that show that people know the actual size of the screen. If you ask people to come into a room with a screen with nothing on it, they will pick locations to sit based on their perception just of the size of the screen. So it has nothing to do with resolution. The crowd that's there gives you a kind of mob effect in addition to the cognitive dissonance. So comedies are funnier when you watch them in a crowd. Now home, it's indoors, you can have a small group, there's some distraction, the screen is smaller and closer, which is an issue for 3D because of Percival's zone of comfort. Handheld, often outdoors, one person typically watching, sometimes you can add another, tremendous amounts of distraction. It's the smallest, closest screen. And then we have virtual reality, which is an individual, but do we maybe go to a movie theater and all of us put on headsets so we can do things, or do we go to the next step and communicate directly to the brain? This is not my idea. This appeared in a 1967 movie called The President's Analyst about the telephone company coming up with a cerebrum communicator that would be injected into your bloodstream and find its way to the brain. But how does a director deal with these things if we're communicating directly to the brain, or even if we're just doing virtual reality or even just 360-degree shooting? The director wants you to look at something. If you're looking the other way, you don't even know what cues the director is giving. Does the director put signs in the back saying, no, turn around, you idiot, look forward? This is not mores, this is mores. Various mores, people talk about more detail resolution, more contrast or dynamic range, more depth for 3D, more frame rate, more colors, more immersive sound. All of the ones in gold there were used in Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, which ended up having about 40 times the information of a regular movie. You can also do more visual field, again, the 360 degrees, and then things that some people call 4D, haptic, feeling things, feeling that you're off balance or whatever, olfactory things, and so on. So some of you may have seen a scene like this in Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, and people say, oh, it was the most realistic battle scenes ever. I have no idea. I've never been in a battle. I can't say whether it was realistic or not. I've seen Billy Lynn both in the Ultra version, the full movie, and in a regular 2D version, and as far as I'm concerned, the battle scenes were the same. They're both pepped up. But this was another scene in Billy Lynn, just a simple love scene in a corridor, not particularly high definition, not particularly high dynamic range, not much motion, and yet that was the one that really attacked me and said, wow, this is something like being a fly on the wall. This is not like watching a movie. Now, the Moores have equivalents in human perception. So what we call detail resolution is attributed to our retinal cells and our saccades. Saccades are little jitters that the eye does all the time. Contrast, our iris adjusts some of the contrast. Chemical adaptation in the retina does more for contrast. Depth, we have two eyes, so we have stereopsis. Frame rate, I'll get to that in a moment. Colors, we either have 3 or 4 cones. Some women have 4 cones, can see more colors than the rest of us. And our rods. Immersive sound, we have 2 external ears. We can generally figure out where sounds are coming from. The visual field, we can move our heads and our bodies. The 4D, tactile, olfactory, and so on. But what about this frame rate? There doesn't seem to be anything in our visual system accounting for frame rate. There may be some psychological things. There are some scientists who think that there are certain clocks in our body. But can we do cinema without any frame rate? So here is a presentation. There's a little spinner with a black dot on it. And when that's done in front of a regular camera, the black dot just very quickly disappears and you don't see anything, maybe a little bit of a gray band. But they've come up with a retinal image sensor, one that reacts to change, and that's what our visual system does. So he's going to slow it down now. Each rotation now is on the order of tens of nanoseconds, and yet you're seeing everything pretty clearly. Now, this is not quite cinema quality, but this is the beginning stages. So conceivably, we could have cinema with no frame rate whatsoever, and things simply react as they change. I mentioned this 4D stuff. This was at the International Broadcasting Convention in 2010. The stuff above, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, 360. I just put in a date there so you can see this is not brand new stuff. They started working on that in 1900. Ultra high definition, high dynamic range, wider color gamut, higher frame rate, sound wave reconstruction. How about haptic and tactile? In this particular thing down at the bottom there's a leg whapper. They were doing a cartoon version of sort of the Tanya Harding story. And so at one point you feel a bang on your legs. But that was also 1900. Olfactory, movies with smell, 1909, people paid to go to those. Gustatory, people were talking about that in the 1920s. Now, based on preliminary viewer tests, on the left is higher spatial resolution, in the middle is higher frame rate, and on the right is higher dynamic range or higher contrast. And the greater the vertical change, the more the perceptual effect. And you can see there's not much perceptual change going from high definition to 4K. There is for every doubling of frame rate, and there's a very big change for increases in contrast ratio, and also increases in contrast ratio add the least amount of bits. So it seems like, wow, that's the way to go. Except in the real world, there's that television viewing again, and notice that the light is on and the blinds are open. In the middle is a 4K presentation that Sony did in a View Cinema in Westfield in the London area. And look at all the light coming off the screen. And what do movie audiences wear? Well, they wear white T-shirts and other white things. So picture looking back from the screen, we can see them very well. So light comes off the screen and gets reflected by everything. The walls, the floors, and so on, and the people who are watching. So maybe for high dynamic range, we need this kind of attire. There's also questions, because this is new stuff, that is virtual reality going to cause some physiological problems or some psychological problems? There are two wonderful scientists who have been hired to look into this. Marty Banks from the Visual Space Perception Laboratory at University of California, Berkeley, and Jenny Reed from the University of Newcastle, both wonderful, wonderful scientists. And I have to point out that in the earliest days of color movies, Leonard Troland, some of you may remember that name, he did a paper on whether movies in color were going to cause physiological problems. But here's a wonderful paper that was published last year in the Journal of the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, and it won the Journal Award. He'll be getting the award next month. And I've just blown up that little thing on the right. We as engineers can easily think of resolution, color, space, luminance, and frame rate as independent technological features, yet the human visual system makes no such stark distinctions. So every time you mess with one thing, if you increase contrast ratio, you increase the visibility of judder or insufficient frame rate. If you increase brightness, you cause all kinds of other stuff. So, do we want to leave our audiences wanting more, or do we want to leave them more than satisfied, or do we want to stupefy them? So that's one question for cinema. But now let's go back to the scene. And as David mentioned, I work a lot in opera. This is not a project that I worked on, but it was a movie that was released in 3D on Carmen from the Royal Opera House in London. And notice the two cranes and a clearly invited audience, because no one's going to pay to have the cranes in the way, and then someone standing on stage and shooting stuff. Well, I'd love to get those kind of shots too, but the opera performances that I send to movie theaters are live in front of a live audience. So I can't do that kind of stuff. But is there anything I can do? Well, I participated in a European project called FINE for Freeview Interactive Network Environment. And there are 3 machine vision cameras. There were another 3. And I'm going to show you what, with processing, these cameras could do. They created a 3D space. And note that the initial image that you see is a straight down shot. I assure you there was no camera suspended from a helicopter. So you can put a virtual camera anywhere when you have been able to define the 3D viewing space. And I would love to do that. I would love to do the things that the Royal Opera House did, except with a virtual camera, so I don't get in the way of the audience. On the left are the 6 initial views, and if you go to the link there, you'll be able to find it. And you don't have to write down the link because these slides are already available online. So, what is the future of cinema? We don't know, because it depends on an awful lot of things, including the desires of corporations to spend money. And you heard from Ang Lee last night that tends to be a problem. Again, these slides are available at bit.ly/LSI-CYTT, as in cinema yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And with the audio, they will be posted on my website pretty soon. Thank you very much.